it's also quite interesting because New York has this potential to create new culture, which many chain stores, dominant city or suburbs cannot do. I think I think you could say the same thing in Tokyo. You know, do you know the place called Harajuku? Harajuku is quite an interesting spot because it's create a lot of like a fashion. You know, they create new fashions, but where they create these new fashion is the back streets of Harajuku and never the main street. Omotesando never creates these. They use the brand of Harajuku as like the fashion capital of Japan, but these main streets, most of the shops, you know, they just sell, but actually new fashion is born in the backside. And but I think New York also have this kind of like this potential to always create culture, which some of the city cannot do.
Well, don't forget, New York is also a media hub, some of the cultural products that are created in New York are immediately described by the media, and these now are global media, so that people all over the world who are interested in such things learn, oh, this is what's going on in New York, this is what's happening. And also there are so many people in New York who are interested in consuming different things that creates an interesting market for entrepreneurs who want to try new things. So if someone wants to create a restaurant that sells mezcal that looks like a restaurant in Oaxaca, Mexico, where do they come? They come to New York. I don't even know if they would go to Los Angeles to do something like that, because Los Angeles may be too close to Mexico to make such a restaurant interesting. I don't know. I'm just wondering. But but New York does indeed have a historic reputation for having lots of people who are willing to try new things. When I say historic, I'm not really thinking of the time in the 1940s or 1950s, but maybe beginning in the 1960s, New York was very open to new things. When people brought their cultures to New York in earlier times, they either sold their products to their own community, or they changed what they sold and weakened it so it would appeal to all Americans as well as other New Yorkers. But maybe from the 1960s and 1970s, New York developed a reputation for more experimentation, more willingness to experiment.
But also, I also see in New York City, even in Manhattan, like a lot of like, for example, community gardens, or like like many plazas, open spaces, which really I think to me it seems like it contributes to this wealth of the city. And how can how can they do this in New York? I mean, it seems to be really economic driven, the city engine, but probably there's also some organization or a people or an institute who's trying to create this, I would say, public value, or like.
Be careful. The community gardens that began in the 1970s were really quite revolutionary. I wrote about the early community gardens as well as current community gardens in Naked City. The community gardens of the 1970s were they were guerrilla actions. Guerrilla in the sense not of monkey, but in the sense of a fighter. Environmental activists literally threw seeds for flowers over the fences that were built around vacant lots, taken by the city government in place of taxes. In the 1970s, many small building owners were no longer able to keep their buildings and to pay for repairs to the buildings because the rents were not high enough to pay them income and also to pay for maintaining the buildings. So many small landlords just abandoned their buildings. And there were, as people around the world know, there were fires to collect insurance on buildings. It was a very bad time, both to be a tenant and to be a building owner. So particularly in low-income neighborhoods. So quite a few abandoned buildings were torn down or fell down because they were in such bad condition. And the lots on which they stood were empty. So when after a certain number of years of not paying taxes, the building owner lost the building, the city government took the building. I'm sure there's a mechanism like this in Japan also, if it happens. So New York City became the owner, even though nobody in the city government wanted to be the owner, but they became the owner of thousands of houses. So the city government, instead of, say, allowing people to squat or to live in these houses, put big fences around the vacant lots. The city government had no money to create housing there, in fact, to make electricity and repairs and decent, healthy housing. It was probably quite dangerous to walk into these spaces. So the city government only put a big fence around these vacant lots. So the environmental activists said, this is not just, this is not good. We could use these lots for something. If nobody can build a house there, at least we can use them for gardens. So they began to throw seeds over the fence and even to take wire cutters and to cut the fence and to make gardens on really terrible, toxic sites. They cleaned up people from the neighborhood and activists who sometimes lived in the neighborhood or sometimes did not. They cleaned up these lots and planted gardens and made them quite beautiful. However, the city government opposed this because the city government was hoping to sell the lots to someone who would build housing one day. And so the city government tried to get the police to throw the gardeners off of these vacant lots. But the gardeners protested, and they got a lot of support from other people. And so the city government gave up the effort to remove the gardens and the gardeners, and they said, okay, our parks department will control the community gardens. And so an entire program was set up to organize community gardens, to make rules for what the community gardeners could do, and to require the gardens to be open to the public, anybody who wanted to go in there, a certain number of hours a week. And in return, the city government distributed equipment and seeds and advice about how to create a garden and maintain a garden. So by the 1990s, there were about 700 community gardens in New York City. As you can understand from the origins of the gardens in abandoned housing, most of them are in very poor neighborhoods where landlords did not find it profitable to continue renting the housing. And so by the time Mayor Rudolph Giuliani took office, the city government had so many thousands of vacant lots and so many community gardens that he decided it would be more profitable for the city government to sell these vacant lots and to sell some of the community gardens as long as developers would be willing to build housing. By the 1990s, New York City's finances had become much better than they had been in the 1970s. The city's financial institutions were employing more people, paying very high salaries, and the idea of developing housing was attractive again to developers who would build for high-income residents. So the community gardens that were in the 1970s considered to be illegal by the 1990s were considered to be very positive amenities for developers. And in fact, a study by the Furman Center for F-U-R-M-A-N at New York University discovered that community gardens raised property values in neighborhoods. Yes, very interesting indeed. So by the end of the 1990s, after a very serious conflict between community gardeners and the Giuliani administration, Mayor Bloomberg took office and resolved the conflict by allowing most of the community gardens to remain in place, while designating some community gardens to be sold for housing development. No community gardeners liked this, but they had to accept it as a compromise. I should say also that during the 1990s, the Attorney General of New York State filed suit against the Giuliani administration, saying that they had not provided an environmental justification for selling the community gardens. So there were political and environmental allies of the community gardens that prevented the city government from selling the gardens at that time. And there were quite a few protests. So after Mayor Bloomberg took office, and some of the community gardens were sold, but most of them remained, sometimes financed by private philanthropies, private foundations that pay for the gardens, which creates its own set of problems, because then who controls the community gardens? Everybody began to talk about the community gardens as a real benefit to the city. At the same time, the Bloomberg administration decided that environmental improvements would be one of the hallmarks, one of the initiatives of the administration. And Mayor Bloomberg appointed a traffic commissioner, a woman named Jeanette Sadiq Khan, who is very progressive, following the example of some European cities, Copenhagen, for example, in creating more pedestrian spaces and more bike paths. She also has put in place programs to decrease the amount of space for automobiles.
Yes, that is very interesting.
Well,
it is very interesting.
It is indeed.
How can it happen? I mean,
it's a gradual process. It took 20 or 30 years,
really?
as my very brief history tries to explain. Community gardens and bicyclists start as a protest movement, very much opposed by the city government, which wants to use the police always to say these are illegal uses of space, these are illegal people engaging in illegal activities. But gradually, over time, an awareness in the public builds that these are good things to have in cities. And then a mayoral administration, a mayor who wants to make a mark on history, says, okay, I will adopt these, that's Bloomberg, I will adopt these principles and make them my principles. And he has proposed some very good things, which have not all been accepted by the New York State Legislature, which has the final control over certain gatekeeping processes. For example, to decrease the number of cars driving into Manhattan, Mayor Bloomberg proposed the adoption of a system like London's congestion pricing.
Oh, really? Okay.
But because this system would require higher prices on bridges and tunnels to enter Manhattan,
it's very easy to do.
Well, it's very easy to do in a physical sense, but not in a political sense, because the New York State Legislature must approve the prices of those tolls, those entry fees on the bridges and tunnels. you'd have to look up exactly what the law is, but the New York State Legislature controls that decision, and they would not allow that. Bear in mind that only a very small portion of the New York State Legislature represents New York City. And the representatives who come from the outer boroughs don't want to see higher prices on the bridges and tunnels to enter Manhattan because they have voters who drive trucks or taxis or cars and do not want to pay higher prices to enter Manhattan. So it's always a real struggle politically to raise the pricing. And then, I'm sorry, I'm not so familiar with this, but there was a court decision by a judge that said something about the congestion pricing decision was not possible. Or, for example, Mayor Bloomberg and his administration proposed that all of the taxis who drive in the city be fuel efficient, more fuel efficient than they are now. But I believe that's where a judge ruled against the city government and said that the owners of the taxi companies do not have to buy those fuel efficient cars. I'm sorry, I'm not really familiar with the exact provisions, but the point I want to make is that in New York City, because of its unusual dependence on laws passed by the New York State Legislature, the mayor and the administration are not free to make some of the changes that would be good environmentally for the city. The question of bike paths is a complicated question too. In every big city, there are so many different interests that conflict. Bike paths, for example, when you go to Williamsburg, you will see a bike path that many people wanted for environmental reasons. However, lots of merchants, store owners, did not want the bike path.
Oh.
First of all, I don't know how it is in Japan, but in Europe as well as in the United States, store owners never want to lose traffic. They don't want to lose automobile traffic or parking spaces for cars. They don't want to lose a tram or a bus if there's a tram or a bus on the street. This is what I observed in Amsterdam very immediately. Bicycles are okay as long as they don't displace means of transportation that bring more people, cars and buses or trams. So there is a lot of opposition to the Brooklyn bike path that goes through Williamsburg and also goes through Park Slope near Prospect Park. Then there's a very particular group of Orthodox Jewish and Hasidic Jewish store owners. The Hasidic Jewish the Hasidic Jews are different even from the Orthodox Jews because they are more strict, and they tend to segregate themselves from others, even from other Jews. Okay. So the Hasidic store owners and the Orthodox store owners did not want a bike path because that would prevent cars from coming, especially on Sunday, which is a day when they do business. And the Hasidic store owners, and I guess the Orthodox store owners, did not like the fact that many of the young women riding bicycles dress in what we call skimpy clothing. You can see a lot of their skin. So the combination of economic opposition and, how shall we say, cultural opposition to cyclists prevented that bike path from being put in place. I think maybe I wasn't in New York last year during some of the conflicts, or I just don't remember all of the conflicts, but it becomes an extremely complicated story where the city government has workers painting the white lines or certain lines of the bike paths one day, but the next week they're painting black over the white lines to destroy the bike path. And I'm not sure exactly where things stand now. But in Manhattan, there has there has been opposition by store owners, but maybe not as much opposition, or maybe the city government feels that in Manhattan they really can make a test case for new traffic calming techniques. And I think they really do see Manhattan as their laboratory for these traffic calming techniques. So that Broadway around Times Square has been closed to traffic. And big pedestrian islands that look almost like beaches have been constructed. Planters with big trees have been put in place to make it safe for people to sit in these spaces. And the city government has placed chairs and tables there. They are taken away at night, or they're locked up at night, but during the day the chairs and tables are free. By the same token, I think that the feeling of safety people have is partly a real change from the past, where they feel they can sit at tables and chairs in the middle of a traffic street. Although we all felt nervous about that at the beginning, thinking that maybe drivers would forget that this was a pedestrian zone and they would drive their car into the tables and chairs. But that has not happened. This feeling of safety also may reflect the presence of many private security guards and more police officers than in the past. There are also many more closed-circuit TVs for surveillance of spaces. Not everywhere, perhaps, but in many places, especially in lower Manhattan. On Orchard Street, for example, I have been told that crime is not a problem, but there is also a small subsidy that the Business Improvement District offers to business people who will install a surveillance camera on the street. And certainly in the Wall Street area, there are many, many surveillance cameras, and undoubtedly on all of the big traffic streets, there are surveillance cameras. So the feeling of safety that we all have in the city partly reflects the very real decreases in the crime rate, but it also reflects more eyes on the street. Okay, but there, so what you see as an environmental
positive this cycle, probably, if it's safe, more people would come.
Oh well, that's certainly true. That's certainly true. And there are, especially with many more young people using the streets in Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens. Not children, but young adults. There is much more of a desire to be out in public and to socialize in public, whether it's people sitting at sidewalk cafes, people using the public parks, people going to free movie showings or theater drama performances on the street. I mean, one thing I have noticed that's new in contrast to the past, in addition to community gardens and traffic calming islands or pedestrian islands, is the large number of performances in public places, in parks, concerts, movies, theater, in public parks, as well as sometimes in parking lots. There's one small independent company of actors that presents Shakespeare in parking lots on the Lower East Side. And again, maybe this is an example of something you mentioned before, the openness of New York City to cultural innovation. I mean, maybe in Japan it would be unacceptable to have a drama performance outside in a park or outside in a parking lot. That's really more unusual than a park, than a parking lot. When you look at the High Line, that elevated freight railroad line that has been turned into a public park in New York City, again you see this willingness to allow innovative kinds of businesses to open there. on the High Line and also under the High Line. Those businesses are food businesses. Okay. There's a new bar, a bar that has opened underneath the High Line. It's just an occasional willingness of the city government to allow new kinds of businesses. I mean, they can be quite severe. As I also wrote about in Naked City, the city government can be quite severe in not allowing innovative activities. Now I'm thinking about food vendors who are really quite seriously harassed, surveilled, controlled by the Department of Health and the Department of Transportation, also the Parks Department. But I'm thinking of something I wanted to say before. Bicyclists. There's a group of activists in an organization called Critical Mass. Critical Mass. I haven't seen what they're doing this summer, but in the past few years, once a month, they would have a mass bicycling excursion that they would not announce in advance. They refused to ask the police for permission to have this demonstration. And you can imagine that it is troublesome to have maybe 600 bicyclists come through traffic in the middle of a big city. So the police really reacted very, very negatively and severely to critical mass riders. When they discovered where they were riding, they would come in huge numbers, and the police would really grab their bicycles and treat them very badly, arrest them, because they were literally breaking the law. So when you say, oh, isn't it wonderful that New York has these bicycle paths and these wonderful initiatives, often these initiatives are approved and encouraged with one hand, but beaten back with another hand. So it really depends on how these initiatives are presented, who is presenting them, and whether the initiators are willing to cooperate with the authorities, including with the police. And the same with community gardens, the same with bicyclists, the same with food vendors and new kinds of businesses that help to create this very friendly, innovative socialization in public space in New York.